back with Ted Awtrey in his home. And Ted, you were going to talk about the Indian raid at Cloverdale.
In 1925.
1925.
Yeah. And it was it was Yaqui Indians. They were living wild just south of the border. And some of the kids came up and they stole some cattle from the Diamond A Cattle Company. And then they did that around the Gray Ranch headquarters. And it was, I believe, a Sunday, and all of the cowboys were drunk. And so they didn't miss any cattle. But one of my uncles was up on the Animas Mountain. He went up there to get away from all the drinking, and he laid down and went to sleep on the ground. Tied his horse's reins around his hand, and so his horse couldn't get away. And then he was laying there asleep, and he heard somebody coming and some Indians talking. So he woke up, and he happened to be behind a tree from them, and they didn't notice him. They were just kids anyway. And so they rode on by, and they were riding the cows that they had stolen. So I guess they walked up there. And so they continued on up the mountain, and he jumped on his horse and rode down to the headquarters and gathered all the drunk people up. And so they formed a group, and they took after them, and they tracked them across the Animas Mountain Range and across the Hatchet Mountain Range, and then they got to the international boundary line. So they quit trailing them there, and the cattle were never recovered. But those cowboys gave interviews to not my uncle, the one that found them. He was sober, so he didn't, but the cowboys gave interviews to the newspaper in Silver City, which was the county seat back then. And they said they were Apaches and they were Geronimo's leftover people and all that baloney. And they weren't, they were just Yaquis. My uncles, well, they was alive whenever I got big enough why they told me about it. Actually, the guy that found them, that seen them, they found him. Well, his twin brother told me about it because he had already passed on by then. And Dad was always going down into Mexico with my granddad, and they would go down there hunting deer and meat to eat. And so they met some of these Yaqui people, and one of the ranchers found a baby that had wandered across the line, a little Yaqui Indian baby, and the little baby was eating grasshoppers to stay alive. And so the rancher felt sorry for him, and he took him home with him. And then he took him back across the border, and there was some folks living just barely the other side of the border. And he knew them, so he took that baby to them, and they raised the baby. And they sent the baby to Cloverdale to go to school, and Dad and him were best friends. And he actually stayed with my grandfather for quite a while and went to school. And so then he got to be a grown man, and he took over part of that rancher's land, and after he got old enough, the guy willed it to him or whatever, I guess. So anyway, he became an airplane pilot, and he was quite a big man down in Mexico.
How close is Cloverdale to the border?
Cloverdale, the Cloverdale Flat actually butts up to the border.
Oh, okay, so it's that close.
Yeah, and the Cloverdale Canyon is about 10 miles from it.
And so it sounds like people would come back and forth across the border.
Yes, there was no fence in.
Yeah. Were there
Well,
problems with that one way or the other?
Well, yeah.
What way?
Guns weren't allowed in Mexico. The Americans weren't supposed to go over there with guns at that time. And my granddad went over there by himself one day and he was hunting. And the Mexican soldiers come along and arrested him. And they took his gun away from him and restrained him and put him on his horse, and they were heading over to Awtrey-February to put him in jail. And they they decided he was a nice man, so they turned him loose and they kept his gun. So he had to buy him a new .30-30. There were a lot of cattle rustling going on. Some of my dad's sister's husband had a homestead that was butted right up against the border. And it was up in the Animas Mountains. He got to exploring around and he found a natural cave that came pretty close to his house that started out in Mexico. So he dug a tunnel from that cave. He dug it north until he stepped it off and he was below his house, and then he dug up and made a ramp so he could drive wagons in and out. And he became a smuggler. He would smuggle people north and going south. It was during the Pancho Villa era, and he would sell guns to Pancho Villa. About 1915, when he was selling guns to Pancho Villa. 1914, 1915, right around in there. He never got caught. My aunt was a real good lady, and he was kind of a trashy guy. And so my aunt raised this little orphan boy. And after I got old enough to be interested in history, why, that little orphan boy was a cowboy down at that Lang Ranch that I talked about earlier. He was the one that actually told me all these stories, because they wouldn't tell my good dad and granddad because they were pretty honest people. So he knew that enough time had elapsed and I wasn't going to tell Dad, and so he told me all these stories. So I got a lot of good history out of him. My uncles on my mother's side came from down in Texas, and they were bad people. On one hand they were bad people, and on the other hand they were good people. And one of my great uncles got caught rustling cattle, and the rancher caught him, I guess, right out in the middle of the river, and they got in a fist fight, and my uncle beat that man to death. So then they had to leave that part of the country, and so they started down towards Del Rio. So the law got after them pretty heavy, so they cut across country and they got to Langtree, Texas, and they stole a horse there. And another bunch of people, law people, got after them. And so they ran across the border into Mexico. And so they stayed in Mexico until they got to Cloverdale. And then they came across and they become cattle rustlers again there. Well, my mother was just a little girl, and her mother traveled around in a wagon all over South Texas. And she was a prostitute part of the time, and part of the time she was a practical nurse. Just whatever job she could get. They wrote her a letter and told her that they was going to their brother Mac's house, and they didn't say where that was at, but it was at Cloverdale. And so they wanted her to meet them out here. So grandmother started out in the wagon, and she had to work as she was coming. And so she was coming in the wagon, and she'd be way out in the middle of nowhere, and she'd get in trouble, and she'd stick the wagon tongue straight in the air and tie it with a red railroad lantern on it, and that was a signal that there was a prostitute there. And it would be all empty country, and you wouldn't think nobody'd be around. But some guy had rode up, and Mama and all the kids had to stay in the wagon, and the wagon cover had to be shut all the time so they couldn't see anything. And grandmother told them if they heard any noise out there, do not look out. One time, they were going up a real steep hill, and the road was washed out, and the wagon fell off the road on the outside down the grade a little ways of the hill. And so Grandma couldn't get it back on the road by herself, so she hung her red lantern up in the middle of the night. Why, they heard a guy out there, Mother did. And so they hooked the horses up, and he pried with a pole, and they got the wagon back on level ground again. And so then by the next morning, that guy was gone. So the kids never seen him. But I imagine Grandma paid him.
When they were rustling cattle, was the idea to get the cows and you graze them and then sell them, or did they steal them and then just sell them right away?
They stole them and then sold them right away, the way I understand it. When they got here, well, they done the same thing. And let's see, I think there was 14 kids in that family. Grandmother got to Deming the day of the bunch of we raided Columbus. And so she heard about it, so she figured, well, somebody got hurt and I can get a job down there working for somebody. So she went down there right away, and she was nursing the sick and the wounded down there. And so Mama was just a little girl, but she had to help pour diesel on the dead Pancho Villa soldiers, and they'd stack them in a stack and burn them, and she helped do that. While she was over there, she met a rustler, another cattle rustler by that name, that she took. She never married him, I don't think, but she took his name, and they moved over in the Animas Mountains at a place called Walnut Canyon, and they built a dugout there. You know what a dugout is?
No.
They dug a hole in the ground, and then they covered it with logs, and then put dirt on top of that, and that's what they lived in. And it was a pretty good hideout up there. But when then her and him and all of her brothers would go down to Mexico, and they would steal cattle, and they would take them up the old trail that went to Santa Rita, New Mexico, up by Silver City. And they would take them up there and they would sell them up around Silver City. And sometimes those kids would stay in that dugout all by themselves for maybe 2 or 3 months. And when that happened, well, they knew that grandma and the guy she lived with had got caught. And they were in jail. And there was also, the uncle on my dad's side that smuggled illegals up out of Mexico and guns into Pancho Villa. And they also drove herds of cattle through that tunnel so they wouldn't be trailed. And then they, how this is the boot heel. Well, they went east of there, and that old trail went up from Janos to Silver City at Santa Rita there, and they would send cattle up that. And one of my uncles was he was a teenager then, so they made a deal with a man that lived pretty close to the border, but in Mexico still, to keep horses there so they'd have fresh horses so they could move faster and they wouldn't get caught. And so that was the great uncle that I talked to about it. And he told me all of this. And he said he stayed with that man in Mexico and his kids. And he was the tender for the horses. He took care of the horses, and he'd have them saddled and ready to go when they got there in the middle of the night. It was probably in the 1930s when they finally quit. And one of them, the guy that beat the man to death in Texas, got caught by a Diamond cowboy stealing stock, and so he had a gun, and my uncle had a gun, and so they stood there and they cussed each other out, and the guy said, I'm gonna turn you into the boss. I'm gonna go eat, and then I'm gonna go turn you in. Well, nobody heard from that cowboy for a few days. So they found him sitting in the door of the little house that he was staying in. He had a plate of food there that had dropped on the ground when he got shot. Then they could see that he was shot from on top of the hill that was right there. So they went up there and they found tracks where somebody had sneaked up and shot him. When I was a little kid, well, we were building fence close to there. And so my dad told me a story about, he didn't know that it was my uncle that did it, but he thought it might be. And I learned that from the other uncle that I got all the information from. He was this guy's little brother. And so when they found this cowboy, they're dead, where they packed him up on top of this little hill where he got shot from, and they buried him right there. So I went and I seen his grave there. My dad had an old school bus, and a 37 Ford school bus, and he lived in that. And when I was out on the fence line, I rolled my bedroll out underneath it for some of the time. And some of the time there would be a cave close enough, and I went and I lived in that cave. Well, that's where my bedroom was in the cave. Sometimes there wouldn't be no cave, so Dad showed me how to make a little house out of bear grass and limbs. And so I'd make me one of them, and I'd live in that. Dad made a wire roller that he could put on the back of his vehicle and roll off all 4 or 5 wires at once. And of course I copied that, and I have one. Yeah, you roll it off, and you roll all 4 wires off at once, and then you stretch them, and then you tie them to the fence post. Of course, the way I do it, and the way Dad did it, is we stretch all the wires, and then we line the wires up. That way we have a straight line to drive the post by. And then we tie it. And for one man working, well, it works out a lot faster that way. One man could, well, I used to build about 1/8 of a mile by myself.
In a day?
In a day. Depended, but usually I did it by the mile. And at first I started out doing it $200 a mile. And then as prices got higher, why, it was $400 a mile, and then $500. And when I quit building fence by contract and retired, why, it was $1 a foot. The rancher bought the material used. And when my dad started contracting fence during the Depression, well, he was charging $125 a mile. I have stories of stuff that I did in Cloverdale.
Yeah.
When my mother passed away, well, I was old enough to, I didn't have a driver's license yet, but I could drive a car, so my older sister sent me down by Cloverdale to tell my dad what happened. And on the way down there, I got almost down there, and I was way out in the middle of nowhere, and I had a flat and no spare. So I took the tire off, and at that time you could just stomp on the edge of the tire, and it would break it loose. So that's what I did. I built me up a fire so I could see, because it was night by then. And I stomped that bead loose on that tire, and then took the tube out and patched the tire and went on in, and to my dad's camp. And I didn't know exactly where it was, but there was not much traffic down there then, so I just, on the old state highway there, I followed along the edge with my eyes, and I seen where there wasn't no road, and somebody had been turning off there, so I figured that's where Dad's camp was at. So then I followed that road that he made just driving through there, and I got to his camp. It was just before midnight. I didn't really want to wake Dad up, because I figured I'd get in trouble, but anyway, I woke him up. Well, when I drove up, I woke him up, of course. And so he came out to see who I was and what the heck I wanted. And so I told him, and then him and my brother got in the car. They each got in their pickups, and I drove. It was Dad's car that I drove back, and he drove his pickup back. And so we got back just at sunup the next morning. So none of us got much sleep that night. One time, we were working on the Animas Mountain building fence, and we camped down at the bottom of the mountain. And then Dad had donkeys that he packed post and wire on, and rolled off wire on one of them, actually. And so we would ride from the bottom of the mountain up to the top and build that fence along the backbone of the Animas Mountain. And it was a lot of solid rock up there, so they, by that time Dad wasn't contracting, he was building fence for wages. And I was too. I made $125 a month. And all my groceries furnished. We took off Saturday at noon, and then we head off Sunday. They was building it so the cattle didn't come up over the top and drift onto the other side in the other pasture. I guess they were having problems with them doing that. Anyway, it was the hardest job that he had had in a long time, and it was my second job that I worked on.
And how old were you?
When I was 16, and we started building that fence from the international boundary line, and we built it north up the backbone of the Ennis Mountain, about 10 miles. We started out, and it was summer, and we finished, and it was winter. One day, we woke up, and well, Dad woke me up. I was living in a cave that was right there by where he was camped. I was sleeping there, and so he woke me up to go to work, and we went out to get the pack donkeys, and they were all gone. So as soon as it got daylight enough, we started tracking them. He and I did, and we tracked them up over the top of the Ennis Mountain, and down the other side, and so it was getting dark by then, and it was raining, and it was cold, and so we found a couple of big clumps of bear grass. It was by a big ditch there, and we crawled up in them, and of course, when you get underneath them, why the water don't get there, and it keeps you warm all night. So that's where we spent the night until about 5 o'clock the next morning. Why, we heard the donkeys braying, and so they had smelled us or heard us or something. I don't know. Anyway, they come to us. Well, we seen mountain lions, and I had a run-in with a bear on that same job. I was the pack team guy, and I rode in front of the donkeys on one donkey, and that's the one that I talked about that raised me. I rode her, even though I was 16 years old. I was still riding her, and my feet were dragging the ground. But well, I was going up the trail taking a load of material up to the fence job, and I had a steep grade going up the mountain. It was really steep right there, and so I was concentrating on the pack train and making sure that they didn't fall off or anything, and I come around a tree that was right at the top, and there stood a bear. He was up on his hind legs and scared me to death. And I jumped off and I ran to the side, and I ran around it and ran up there to get Dad. And I figured that them donkeys, he just had it. And so I went screaming and hollering up there to Dad, and he had seen the whole thing, I guess. He was laughing at me. He really thought it was funny. And so I was standing there all out of breath explaining to him what happened. And that little donkey that always rode, she come up and she butted me real hard and just knocked me flat. And then Dad did laugh. Oh man, he thought that was funny. And when I recovered enough to look up, well, the donkeys had come on, and they were right there. After I was grown, and the ranch belonged to somebody else now, and I went back down there to work for them, and me and this guy that I was working with was walking along, talking, going. We had repaired some fence, and we were going back down the hill. And we were going along talking, and all of a sudden the brush just exploded right beside us, and sticks flying everywhere. A deer took off from there and started running. And a mountain lion was right behind it, and it caught it and ate it. So we were like, maybe 10 feet away from it when it happened. And we had no idea that lion was there. Yeah, we'd see tracks all the time, and we'd see them and bear quite often. After I was grown and I went back, somebody else owned the ranch then, but I went back down there to work. And so my job was, there was a trail that Dad had built back during the Depression that went from the bottom of the mountain up to the top to a cistern that he had built up there. And so it was my job to go up there and clear that trail because it had got all messed up, trees in it and stuff. And I got hired to do that, so I camped down at the bottom of the mountain, and there was a spring there. There is a spring there. And there was a cattle drinker there that was empty. It didn't have any water in it. So it was summertime, so I got in there and rolled out my bed, and I was sleeping there. And I woke up to a big racket, and it was a bunch of Cootamundis, you know what they are, I guess. There was a whole bunch of them up in the trees around there, and I shined the flashlight, and they was really agitated at me. I guess they liked that place or something. Anyway, they were really agitated at me. There were probably 15 or 20 of them. One night I was sleeping on the ground again, and it was wintertime, so I had my head all covered up. And I just kind of gotten bit, I guess. I can't remember now. But anyway, I felt a snake crawling up on top of my bed. That was a big old rattlesnake. That one, he crawled up on top of my bed, and he was trying to figure out how to get in there to get warm with me.
Yeah.
And so it was a big thick sleeping bag, so I just hit it and knocked him off, and then I had a flashlight right there, and I got the flashlight and I killed the snake. Yeah, because it's really dangerous when you're working out there with them.
Yeah.
It's easy to get killed.
Yeah.
And it's miles and miles down there to the doctor. Part of the time there was a doctor in Lordsburg, and the rest of the time we had to go to Deming to the doctor. It was about 100 miles to Deming from down there. Even down here, just off of Highway 9, where all those telescopes are now, there was a man had his family there, and they were swimming in a dirt tank, and it had lots of water in it at that time, and they were swimming in there, and one of the little kids got snake bit. So he jumped in the car right quick and headed out for Deming. The kid died before he got there, even that close. So I was glad I didn't get bit by a rattlesnake. When I was still going to school, when we lived there at the White Place, well, I was down south of the house, and the last train came through that came through, and it was a steam engine, and they were transporting it somewhere, I don't know where. But anyway, I heard the train came in, and it sounded different. And I come out of the brush, and I looked, and I seen it was an old steam engine, so I got all excited, and I was barefoot. It was summertime. And I started running to get up there so I could get a good look at that steam engine. And I was laying it down through there, and I stepped right in the big middle of a coiled up rattlesnake, and barefoot. And he didn't strike me. I guess I scared him as bad as he scared me. So when I seen that I didn't get killed, well, I killed him right fast, and then I started running again, and I made it up to the railroad, and I got to watch the train take off again.
When the regular trains were running, what were they hauling? What were they carrying?
They hauled a lot of copper from the mine in Bisbee, and just general freight that they hauled. During World War II, they hauled a lot of troops, and then even after that, why, every once in a while a troop train would come through. Yeah, and I would, every time I'd see a train coming, especially a freight train, well, I would run over to the track and I'd got pretty close to the track, and then I'd start jumping up and down and hollering and waving. And when the train crew seen that, why, they would throw a roll of comic books off to me. And
Cool.
and I would read them, and I'd always have some that I'd already read. And there'd be a guy there with his hand out, and I'd go up close to the track and hand his comic books back, and then I guess he'd take them to some other little kid, I don't know. There were kids at the section house, and sometimes I played with them, and sometimes I didn't. Most of the time I played by myself, I guess. My granddad, he would, during the days of Prohibition, he would make beer in Cloverdale and then bring it over here and sell it. And
Here to rodeo?
yeah. And he would bring Dad with him. And Granddad was a blacksmith part of the time, part of his life, and part of his life he was a farmer. And so when he came over here, he made friends with the blacksmith. So he'd leave Dad in the wagon at the blacksmith shop. It was over by where the rodeo grocery is now. It was right next door to that. And so he would leave Dad over there, and he said, "I'd be back in a minute, son." And he'd take off, and he'd come to this house here. And he'd always be in a hurry to get here. And then when he come back, well, he'd be whistling and singing and all happy. There were a lot of bars, 25, I think they said.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was during that area when Grandpa would make the home brew and bring it over here and sell it. And at that time, he would come to Skeleton Canyon from Cloverdale. And he would come to Apache, and he would sell some of it there at that store at Apache. And then he would come on up here and sell some more of it. And he was always able to sell it. He knew everybody that wanted it, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Do you know why they call it Skeleton Canyon?
Because there's a lot of people died there, and a lot of skeletons have been found. That was before, well, probably even while Dad was here. But anyway, there was a lot of smuggling went on through there. And there was an old trail that went to Tucson. So they would smuggle loads out of Mexico, and it would go through Skeleton Canyon. And a lot of people died there. One of the things I like to do, I'm a dowser. I hunt for water for people, and then I like to go out and I hunt old graves. And I found several old graves in Skeleton Canyon with 2 brass rods.
Same as dousing for water.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. How did you learn how to do that?
Well, I was working over east of what is now the town of Playas for a guy over there, and he was quite a guy. He was real hard to get along with, and he hired me to build fence for him at first. And at that time I finally got a contractor's license, and I was contracting fence for him. And so he decided he was going to build a grape vineyard over there. And he needed a water well to do it with. And there is a gentleman here in the country that he's 90 years old now, so he probably don't do it anymore. But he used to douse for water. And he had hired this guy to come and do several wells for him. And of course, the poor guy couldn't get along with him. Nobody could. He told me, well, I need a well and I can't get this man to do it for me. So you find me somebody that'll do it. And I hunted around and asked that gentleman what the story was. And he said, oh, that guy's too crazy. I ain't going to mess with him. And I didn't blame him. And so anyway, I told him I couldn't find anybody that would do it. And he said, well, you learn how to do it and you do it. So I got online and I learned how, and then I went and talked to the other gentleman. He was a friend of mine. And he taught me a whole bunch. And so I learned to do it, and I've been doing it ever since. Like I was telling you, I learned how kind of on my own and kind of from that other gentleman that did it. That guy told me, well, why don't you do it for me? Ben, we can't find anybody that'll do it. So then I got online and I learned how to do it online, and then from that other old gentleman, he still is a friend of mine. And I learned how to do it from him. And so then I went and found a well that, well, he had one well for the vineyard, but he needed 125 gallons a minute to do it. And so I went right there close and I found another well, and he got water in that, and between the two, well, then I found another one after that. So between all three wells, he had what he thought would be enough water. And so then I did it for him, and so this old gentleman that's a friend of mine, he said, well, why don't you just, I'm getting kind of old to do this, why don't you just start doing it? So I started doing it, and I've been doing it ever since. And I've had real good luck finding water, and also old grays. And I really enjoy finding the old grays. I use brass rods.
Brass.
And I just got a brass welding rod, and I bent it so I would have a handle to hold on to, and I have two of them. And then I asked for it in my mind. I asked myself, where is the best water around here? And then those rods just bend, and they, in my hands, they slide in my hands on the handles, and they point towards the water. And I go over there, and then when I get to the water where they cross, and you can control what your rods do with your mind. Whenever I find water, I can tell them to whirl in my hands, and they'll just whirl circles in my hands. But I like to have them cross. I like to get online and research from the old Calvary days. They have a record of where the graves are at. And I found one grave up here in El Canyon. It was right in the mouth of El Canyon. The man was a scout for the Army. And nobody knew his name for sure. They thought it was Peters or Pete. They didn't know for sure. But anyway, they had a record of that, and I went and found his grave. And when I found it, it was marked with a circle of rocks around it, and then a cross and all that. And somebody moved in and they bought that property, and they didn't realize what it was, and they bladed over it. So then I went back and located it again, and I think they've marked it now. When I was a little boy, my dad told me that he knew an old man, the freighter that found Johnny Ringo dead when he was a little kid. And that old man told him that right there at the Cloverdale store used to be the Clinton Ranch. And he said that they had stole some cattle out of Mexico, and they brought them up to that ranch, and they were sorting them out. And so the Mexicans came and to try and get their cattle back, and they got in a shootout. Old man Clinton got killed, and his grave is right behind the Cloverdale store now. And when Dad told me that story, and when I was a kid, I went out there and found that grave, and I found a finger bone, and I put it in my pocket and took it to school and grossed all the girls out with it. Yeah, they'd come all over to Cloverdale to the dances. When Uncle Willie got shot, why, then Dad wanted to follow the tradition and be a fiddler too, so he started playing for the dances. And so he would play for the dances a lot, and he got to be pretty popular, I guess, and he went all over playing for the dances. And then this guy wanted to learn how to play a fiddle, so he got Dad to show him how to play the fiddle. And so Dad was getting kind of tired of it because he was expected to do a lot of drinking, and he didn't like to drink. So he was getting kind of tired of it. And this other guy didn't mind drinking, I guess. And so he learned a bunch of more modern songs, and he got really popular. He was going to great big dances everywhere and playing for them. And Dad had just went to some of the ranchers' houses and the homesteaders' houses around and played. Granddad was real gregarious, and he was real friendly with everybody. And at that time, you had to go by the Slaughter Ranch to go to back and forth between Douglas and Cloverdale. And so Granddad would come by in the wagon, and he'd stop and talk to John. And John invited him to, every time he'd come through, to just stay all night there. So he stayed all night with John. Granddad and John would talk, and Dad would sit and listen. And one time when they were there, they left the next morning, and Dad pulled a little pocket knife out of his pocket, and it was real pretty. And he started playing with that knife, and Granddad seen it, and he said, "Where'd you get that knife?" So Dad told him, "Well, Mr. Slaughter had a case there, and I got it out to play with it, and then I forgot to put it back." Granddad turned the wagon around, and back they went. And so Dad was real scared. And so he made Dad walk up to Mr. Slaughter and tell him that he took that knife. So Mr. Slaughter had just got through chasing a man that had stole the horse from him. He chased him down into Mexico, and he came back with a horse, but he didn't come back with the guy. So Granddad had just got through telling Dad that he probably just killed him down there. So Dad was afraid he was going to get shot. So anyway, Mr. Slaughter picked Dad up and went over to a chair and sat down and set him in his lap. And he said, "Now, why did you take that knife, son?" And so Dad said, "Well, I thought it was pretty, and I just wanted to play on it, with it." And so he said, "Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you that knife, son." So he gave him the knife. And he said, "Now, you be sure and don't take nothing else, though, from anybody without telling them."
Wow.
And that's all that happened. He was really nice and gentle with Dad. But from that day on, Dad never stole nothing.